The Secret Stone by Andrea Pearson. Copyright 2018 Andrea Pearson. Dedication. To Clara, Lillian, Peter, and Eric. We love you. Chapter 1. Ashley opened the door to her favorite room in the mansion where she and her parents had just moved. She motioned inside, glancing back at her best friend, Alex. This is where my school and martial arts tutors come. Alex shook his head, stepping into the room. You and your martial arts. I don't know where you get the interest for that from. Ashley chuckled. Having retired FBI agents for parents might have something to do with it. She was only 12 years old, but she'd been training in several fighting styles and as a gymnast since she was 2. It had consumed her life, and she absolutely loved it. Yeah, I just wish you hadn't moved to New York City. I know. But it's only a couple of hours from where we used to live. She was just finishing showing him around the mansion that sometimes doubled as an FBI base. They probably didn't need such a large place to live, but the huge building had already proven beneficial. It housed a large gym, an amazing weapons room, and plenty of places for private meetings. And since her parents were now FBI consultants after retiring as high-ranking agents, they did a lot of training, intel, and meetings with the agency. Luckily for her family, consultants made a whole lot more money than actual agents did. Alex led the way across the room to a window and leaned up against the frame, staring out. I still can't get over how much greener it is here. It's New York City, for crying out loud. It's not supposed to be prettier than upstate New York. Seriously? Since when has October been this nice anywhere? It bothered Ashley, and she had reasons to believe why it was that way, but nobody would listen. She'd given up after trying to explain it to her parents. If they didn't believe her, no one would. Regardless, the city was bursting with flowers and blossoms, and the trees were still putting out new leaves. Their branches were heavy from how much foliage they had now. It was as if New York City was welcoming her to live there, when it didn't exactly welcome anyone, not from what she'd been told. Are you hungry? Ashley asked, tucking her thoughts away. Alex nodded. Good. Let's grab some food. She motioned for him to go ahead, but he hesitated. I know you showed me where the kitchen is, but there's no way I'll find it again. Ashley smiled. I totally get it. It's this way. They continued discussing the changes Ashley had to make since moving, including wardrobe and friends, while she led him toward the kitchen. Friendships were hard to forge when you were tutored at home. It had been that way nearly her entire life. With both parents acting as agents, they had traveled a lot, and staying in one place to go to school was difficult. The thing about the clothing was especially annoying. It did not look like fall outside. It was nice and green. But the weather was definitely chilly, something everyone was having a hard time explaining. Why were the trees still sending out new leaves when the old ones should be dying and falling off? The friends were just about to step through the kitchen doors when Ashley heard a familiar voice. She grabbed Alex, pulling him away from the door before he stepped into view. Have you talked to her yet? Henrietta's voice came from the kitchen. Henrietta was one of Ashley's least favorite FBI agents. Bossy and controlling, the mean older woman always seemed to think Ashley's parents weren't parenting correctly. Of course not, Mom said. Ashley's heart warmed. Her mom always stood up for her, against Henrietta. I know we sprang this on you, but she's been training her whole life, Henrietta said. It's completely out of the question. Mom practically spat the words. Ashley was surprised by the acidic tone she used. Dad cleared his throat. Why'd we put her in gymnastics and martial arts? You too. Mom wailed. Ashley and Alex met eyes. What were they talking about? Obviously Ashley. But in what context? Dad continued. You push so hard for her to be prepared. Why, if not for something like this? Henrietta spoke up again. She'll be completely safe. The warehouse is already under our control. Why can't Agent Min do it? Mom asked. She's not small enough. And she's still on that case in Phoenix. Ashley's stomach turned sour as they changed the subject and started discussing the results of a case her parents had just consulted on. She hated that they were talking about her, but at the same time, it made her excited. She really had been training her entire life to be an agent. Was this her opportunity? She hadn't thought it would come so early. For the rest of Alex's visit, Ashley tried to focus on him, but she knew he could tell she was distracted, and they eventually decided it was time for him to go home. His mom picked him up in between errands she was running, and Ashley waved goodbye from the front porch. She tried not to dwell on the conversation they'd overheard, but she failed miserably. She wasn't surprised when Mom took her aside later, after they'd finished dinner. Mom sat on the overstuffed leather couch in the family room, indicating for Ashley to sit next to her. Have you heard what's going on lately? About? She cleared her throat. The stone? Yes, Ashley said. I did a paper on it, The Myth of the Secret Stone. It was supposedly kept somewhere in the Bermuda Triangle. The myth said that whoever had possession of it could control life. Ashley leaned toward her mother. It's here, isn't it? In New York City? It's the reason the plants are growing so well, even though it's October. Mom shook her head disbelievingly and rubbed her temples. Regardless of whether the stone has powers, it's been stolen from a museum in Florida. They claim it was only on loan to them from the Bermuda Triangle. Her words were laced with sarcasm. Either way, it's incredibly valuable and very, very old. We figured out where it's being stored, but you can't reach it. Ashley knew where this was going. Not without damaging it. The warehouse where it's stored is totally walled off. The only way to get in would be by blasting through. But we don't know beyond a certain point where the stone might be, and we're not sure if breaking down walls would trigger something that would actually destroy it. It's far too valuable and rare for us to treat it that way. You need my help, right? Mom put her hand on Ashley's knee. I'd never ask you. I'll do it. Ashley looked at her mom earnestly. The stone's powers are real. Have you seen what's been happening in Florida since it got stolen? The real owners, the ones in the Bermuda Triangle, they know it's gone. They want it back, and they're punishing Florida until it's returned. Ashley grabbed her phone, quickly Googling Florida, and showing her mom the top images that popped up. If New York City was a botanical garden, Florida was the exact opposite now. Everything was dying. Fish were piling up on the shores of the beaches, dead and stinking. Birds were dropping from the sky. Palm tree leaves were blackening and falling to the also black grass. It was obvious to Ashley that Florida was being punished by the owners of the secret stone. Mom was completely speechless. Ashley could tell she didn't know what to believe. Not wanting to push her luck with her mom, she shut her phone off and asked, "When do we go?" Mom rubbed the back of her neck. You start training here tomorrow. Chapter 2. The sounds of construction happening in the mansion overnight were muffled, but Ashley still heard them and barely slept. She knew they were building a set that would replicate the warehouse she would need to navigate to find the stone. There was practically nothing her parents couldn't do if they set their minds to it, and having their basement changed into a stage wasn't outside their grasp. When Ashley finally got up, her trainers were already there. They had her dressed in a slick, dark gray uniform that went neck to ankle to wrist. They tightly braided her hair and painted her skin dark gray. Why the camouflage? Ashley asked. It's just a precaution, Henrietta said. The woman had been hovering around since the trainers arrived. Ashley resigned herself to Henrietta's presence for this mission. Apparently, it was under her jurisdiction. Yes, but it's gray. Because that's the color of the heating and cooling tunnels, a man answered. Ashley was about to respond when her tired brain finally computed what Henrietta had said. It was a precaution. They'd reassured her over and over again that the warehouse was under their control and nothing dangerous lurked there. So why camouflage her, unless they had reason to believe the warehouse wasn't really empty? Ashley didn't get the chance to ask her questions before they whisked her out of the prep room, handing her a map of the maze of HVAC shafts she needed to memorize, asking her to look it over on the way to the basement. Once they got there, the map was taken away, and hands-on training began. She'd learned earlier that heating and cooling usually use the same big metal ventilation tunnels, called an HVAC system, but this mission was the closest she'd ever gotten to them. And after an hour, she hoped it would be the last. The work was grueling and tiring, and not for the first time, she was grateful for her years of martial arts and gymnastics training. Scooting around on her stomach, using her arms, elbows, and toes to push and pull herself, was very difficult. They had her memorize the twists and turns and hallways and intersections, including multiple ways to her destination and multiple ways back. It took all day, broken up periodically for tutoring and meals. Finally, the agents, including Henrietta, decided to call it quits for the day. "But where's the stone?" Ashley asked on the way out of the basement. All of the HVAC passages they had her memorize led to a room in the middle of the makeshift warehouse. But that room was completely empty. "We don't know," Henrietta said. "Our technology that got us the layout of the HVAC system sees through almost the whole building, but when it reaches that room, we can't break in. Something prevents access." Ashley didn't respond, but she realized now the reason for the camouflage. They really didn't know if the building was empty. How on earth had they convinced Mom to let her do this? Unless Mom didn't know everything about the mission. Even though Ashley felt like she was ready after one day of training, Henrietta and the other agents made her practice for another 2 full days. They wanted to be absolutely certain that regardless of what happened, she'd be able to find her way. As it turned out, that decision would end up saving her life. Chapter 3. Finally, it was time to go. Ashley couldn't wait. The last 3 days had been so long and tedious, so physically grueling. Her brain itched to be used, to be put to the test. She felt ready. Her arms and legs tingled. Even her toes and fingers tingled. She'd never worked so hard for something in her life, in such a short amount of time. The FBI was emphatic that she have recording devices and cameras all over her, letting them know everything that was going on. They'd also given her a camera with sticky 2-way tape that she was to install just outside of the HVAC system in the room where the stone was being kept. And then, her instructions were to turn around and head back. They'd monitor the room for several days, gathering intel and figuring out just where the stone was stored. Once they were absolutely positive on the location of everything, and if the situation looked dangerous, they'd hire someone else to go back in. Ashley would only return if the camera showed that the warehouse was truly empty. She was forbidden from trying to find the stone. They would be watching very closely, keeping in contact through a radio-type thing in her ear. Ashley didn't mind. This was, after all, her first mission. She had zero desire to start off on the wrong foot. They put the equipment on her, then helicoptered her to the top of the warehouse, where she would enter the ventilation system. Ashley had wondered about the noise of a helicopter, but when she'd asked, they'd said it hadn't drawn attention yet. Nothing had so far. Yet another reason they believed the building might be empty. Her parents didn't accompany her, only grouchy Henrietta did. At Ashley's timid request, Mom and Dad would be back at the mansion, watching the feed with the others. She was already nervous, and Mom's tears would make it hard for her to focus. They usually did. Henrietta definitely wouldn't cry. Ashley didn't think the woman even had more than just the grouch emotion. Ashley watched as one of the agents who'd flown in the helicopter with her opened the ventilation shaft she'd need to enter. "Be careful," Henrietta said, drawing Ashley's attention. "Make sure you set up the camera where it can see the whole room." Ashley had been thinking of that particular instruction for a while. What if there isn't anywhere I can put it near the opening on the other end? Henrietta shook her head. Put it up anyway, and we'll get as much detail as we can." After giving her a couple more last-minute instructions, Henrietta hopped back into the helicopter and was whisked away. She'd return in an hour or two to pick Ashley up again. Ashley turned and stared at the open ventilation shaft. There would be a short drop down that she'd need to navigate before entering the main tunnel. She had plenty of plunger things to stick to the sides of the shaft to lower herself with, and she was yet again grateful for her upper body strength. It saved her from making an idiot of herself during practice, especially since this was the part they'd had her work on the most. Ashley took a deep breath, calming herself, before entering the shaft headfirst. She slowly lowered herself, using the click-on, click-off system of the plungers, bracing her feet against the sides of the tunnel. Once she reached the bottom, she finagled herself into a flat position, navigating that first turn, and proceeded forward in the main shaft. She'd done this so many times over the last 3 days, she almost didn't need to keep her eyes open or to think about her actions. The earpiece whined, giving off some white noise, and her parents' voices crackled over the system. "Great start, Ashley," Dad said. "Yes, you're doing very well," Mom said, no trace of tears in her voice. Ashley smiled, giving a thumbs up. She knew one of the cameras on her somewhere would catch it. They hadn't told her not to talk, but that tingling sensation hadn't gone away yet, and she was starting to think it was a warning to be extra cautious. The building wasn't empty, it couldn't be. It didn't feel vacant. After only 10 minutes of being in the ventilation system, with at least 5 more minutes to go, the radio system went out completely. The sudden silence was deafening, and Ashley hesitated, her ears ringing in the void. They'd worried this would happen. They had no idea what was in the walls of the warehouse that prevented their systems from seeing inside. It was why she was there to observe, install that camera, then get out before being seen. That was, if anybody was there. Mom would have absolutely forbidden her from doing any of this if she'd known there was a chance someone was in the warehouse. In the FBI's defense, they'd apparently been watching the warehouse for several weeks and had seen zero action around it. The walled-off doors and windows didn't change once, and no openings appeared for anyone to go through. The underground system of the city didn't lead to the warehouse. It was completely cut off from everything. Ashley adjusted to the lack of sound, finally reaching the end of the ventilation system. The room where the stone was supposedly held opened up before her. No grate covered this end of the tunnel. The room was about the size of a big living room, and she could easily see through all of it. Right off the bat, she learned the building wasn't empty. 2 men were there, talking, staring at what she now realized was the stone. It was on top of a pedestal in the middle of the room, and gave off a sickly, orangish-green light. That surprised her. She would have expected it to be pleasant to look at. Instead, it made her stomach turn, and she was forced to look away. "Time to pack up?" a younger man said to the other guy, one with gray hair and a long lab coat. "No. Only 15 more minutes. We have to keep it here for that long, otherwise the army won't come fully to life." "Army?" Ashley quietly pulled the little camera from her pouch, taking off the protective strips from the tape. The man continued, "If we remove it, the bodies will crumble, and we'll have to start over." "I guess that makes sense," the younger man said. He glanced at the floor. "I still struggle to believe it actually works, though. That they're really going to come alive down there." The older man motioned to the floor. "You've seen them, isn't that enough?" "I suppose." He'd seen whom? Was there really a dead army being brought to life? With a quick glance to make sure the men wouldn't notice, Ashley snaked her arm around the corner and pressed the sticky side of the camera against the wall. She held it firmly in place for several seconds, making sure it wouldn't fall. From there, the FBI would have a great view of the entire room. The younger man got a distasteful expression on his face as he stared at the floor and lit a cigarette. Ashley tilted her head, trying to figure out what he was looking at that disgusted him so much. The floor had a weird pattern to it, sort of hexagonal, like the floor of those playground houses, the sort that had rubber-coated metal bottoms. It was almost as if there were holes in the floor here, just like the holes in a playground. Ashley shook her head, trying to stay focused, and reached around the corner to make sure the camera really was going to stay. That tape was strong stuff. It didn't even budge when she tried to wiggle the camera. The man puffed on his cigarette one more time before setting it in an ashtray on a desk. Behind the desk were tall stacks of cardboard boxes. In the top of an open one, Ashley saw jars of peanut butter and jam. Had these two men been camping out here? And if so, for how long? The other boxes probably had supplies in them too, judging by the company names on the sides. "I'm going to finish packing my things." The younger guy turned to go, but his associate grabbed his shoulder as he passed. "You'd better hurry, Jeff. We've only got 15 minutes before the stone finishes its work, and they'll be fully alive. And actually, would you mind packing my—" He paused, staring at Jeff with a doubtful expression. "Never mind. I'll do it myself. Let's go quickly though, I don't want to miss anything." They left together, exiting through double doors that swung behind them. Ashley remained where she was, frozen, lying in the ventilation shaft. It wasn't just what the older man had said, about an army coming alive in 15 minutes, but something about the floor caught her attention. Movement down there. As she studied the hexagonal pattern, she realized it really was holes. And standing there underneath the floor were hundreds and hundreds of men packed in tightly. Their eyes were unblinking, their skin a grayish green. The reason Ashley hadn't noticed them at first was apparent: they were slightly ethereal. See-through. Not fully there. But as she watched, their forms were slowly solidifying. A couple of them shifted position here and there, almost as if they were becoming aware of the fact that they'd been cramped together for a long, long time. What was going on? Was the stone actually magical? Did it really bring things to life? Ashley had suspected, but a part of her had always believed that the stories she'd read were exaggerated. That it wasn't entirely possible that one single stone could possibly control life. And yet, even as she watched, the army of zombie-like men below grew stronger in appearance, their hazy outlines slowly shifting away. 15 minutes. The older man said they had only 15 minutes until the army was completed. That definitely wasn't enough time for Ashley to get back to headquarters, for the agents to study the room, and for them to come up with a plan. And 15 minutes obviously wasn't long enough for Agent Min to return from Phoenix. These men did not have good intentions with an undead army. It didn't take a lot of brains to figure that out. Ashley had to do something, and she had to do it now. She didn't have a choice. Knowing that Henrietta and her parents would be absolutely furious, not to mention afraid, and freaked out as they watched, Ashley quietly lowered herself from the ventilation system, landing on the catwalk below. Her feet rang out hollow on the metal, and she cringed, waiting for Jeff and the other dude to burst back into the room, guns blazing. Nothing happened. Ashley closed her eyes for a moment, swallowing, and said a quick prayer. And then, as quietly as she possibly could, and grateful again for her experience in martial arts and gymnastics, she stepped across the metal catwalk and started down the narrow, rickety stairs at the end. She stopped near the bottom, hesitating before putting her foot on the floor. The army was just below her, only about 6 inches away. Could they see her? Were they watching? Holding her breath, Ashley placed her foot firmly on the floor. She froze again, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The army didn't move. No alarm sounded, and the two men didn't return. But the army was more solid in appearance now. Was it because she was closer, or were they finished coming alive? "Please, don't be done yet, stay dead a little longer." Ashley tiptoed across the room, approaching the greenish-orange glowing stone. It was diamond-shaped and had intricate weaving designs on it, surrounding a reddish center gem-type thing. She picked it up. It was lighter than she'd expected, and by quite a bit, almost like it was styrofoam. But as she gripped it, she could tell it was tougher than it felt, and wouldn't be easy to break. She turned back toward the stairway again, but stumbled when she saw one of the army men below turning his face up to her. Oh man! It was watching her. Ashley stumbled backward, her foot catching on something and flying out from beneath her. The stone shot out of her hand, banging against the desk's metal leg with a loud clang, before coming to a rest on the floor by the pedestal. It didn't take long to see that the man below had turned to see the stone, not her, and that he was still hazy in appearance. He wasn't alive, he just was aware of the stone. He hadn't taken his eyes off it. Stupid, stupid Ashley, she whispered to herself. Men's voices in the hallway behind her made her jump. She glanced around the room, wringing her hands, looking for a place to hide. Her eyes landed on the cardboard boxes. Ashley hurried over, stepping behind them just as the men entered the room. She watched through a crack between the boxes, holding her breath, trying not to move. What happened? Jeff asked. Not sure. The older man bent and retrieved the stone from where it had fallen, putting it back on its pedestal. Huh? Professor Horowitz, did they move it? Jeff asked, staring at the floor. Professor Horowitz rubbed his chin, looking troubled. I don't know. Possibly. They watched the floor for a moment. Neither seemed willing to do anything, and Ashley tried not to whimper in impatience and fear. She had to get that stone out of there. Professor Horowitz grunted. We'd better not leave the stone alone, just in case they can move it. He put his hand on Jeff's shoulder. You watch for 5 minutes. I'll finish packing, then take over so you can finish too. Jeff gave Professor Horowitz a skeptical look. Do we even have that long? Professor Horowitz bit his lip, staring at the army. We might not. Tell you what, I'll be back in 3 minutes. Like I said, I don't want to miss anything. Professor Horowitz left, and Ashley was alone with Jeff. He rested his arm on the pedestal, his back to Ashley, as he continued to stare at the army through the holes, a troubled expression on his face. What was she supposed to do? She didn't need a working earbud to know that her parents and the FBI agents were most likely freaking out, screaming at her to get out before it was too late. Mom was probably sobbing while her dad yelled at the monitors. And honestly, she didn't blame them. Ashley frowned, realizing something. With the radio system gone, there'd be no way they could have heard what Professor Horowitz and Jeff said about the army. They wouldn't know why she was still there. She closed her eyes, pushing her way through the humiliation that made her face flush hot. They probably thought she was trying to be a hero. She tried to get one of the cameras to face the army below, but didn't know if it was good enough quality to see through the holes. She contemplated dropping to her knees, but she wasn't sure that would be enough, not with how dark it was in the space behind the boxes. Plus, being that close to the army seriously gave her the heebie-jeebies. Ashley had to get that stone out of there, and to do that, she had to get Jeff to move. But how? She needed a diversion. Her gaze roved the room as she looked for something, anything, that would help. She briefly considered throwing one of the smaller boxes, but she knew that wouldn't distract him long enough for her to run and grab the stone, then dash up the stairs and escape through the HVAC system. What she needed was something a bit more distracting than that. What she needed was fire. Her eyes landed on the cigarette still in the ashtray, just around the corner from where she was hiding. The cardboard boxes were flammable. Hopefully, they didn't have explosives in them, because if they did, she and the 2 men would be dead. But there was nothing else immediately flammable in the room. She probably had another minute before Professor Horowitz returned. 2, if he didn't include his walking time in those 3 minutes. Ashley inched her way out from behind the boxes, eyes glued to the back of Jeff's head, praying and hoping he wouldn't turn and see her. She breathed between each step so she could be certain her feet fell silently. She finally reached the cigarette and picked it up, then retreated to where she'd been hiding. After another glance to make sure Jeff still hadn't moved, she walked to the opposite end of the makeshift hallway and held the lit end of the cigarette to the edge of one of the boxes there. Flames licked up from the cardboard, racing to the top and igniting the box above. As she headed back to her original hiding place, Ashley started a fire in several different locations, hoping Jeff wouldn't be able to put them all out. She put the cigarette under the desk, right next to a box where it could start yet another fire. And then she waited. It only took seconds for Jeff to notice the flames. His body stiffened, and he stared at the fire before acting. "Fire!" he shrieked. He dashed toward the flames, pulling off his shirt and beating the flames as hard as he could. If Ashley hadn't been so frightened, she would have laughed. At that point, the flames needed the oxygen he was providing them, and the only thing he did was give them more fuel to burn. With him finally distracted from the stone, she dashed as quietly as she could across the room, before picking up the rock and thrusting it into her pocket. And then she raced to the staircase, glancing back as she did so. The flames were rushing up the entire wall of boxes now, flowing across the ceiling and melting the paint and plaster, licking at the underlying wood and steel support. Ashley didn't know much about warehouse construction, but she'd seen one or two of them on fire and knew they weren't invincible. Unfortunately, the flames were eating up the ceiling near her escape route, and she didn't have much time to get out before her only exit would be melting hot. She started up the staircase, quietly winding her way, hoping she wouldn't be seen. Professor Horowitz ran into the room, panicked, and together he and Jeff tried to beat the flames down. The professor was smarter than Jeff, though, and grabbed a fire extinguisher from behind the boxes, ordering Jeff back. By now, the flames had grown too big, and the extinguisher did almost nothing to them. As Professor Horowitz fought, he turned in the direction of the staircase and spotted Ashley. "Hey, you! Stop!" Ashley ignored him. She scurried into the ventilation shaft and wriggled along it as quickly as she could, no longer caring if the men heard her. Guns started discharging as she reached the first fork, and the ventilation shaft to the left, the one she was supposed to take, filled with holes. She was forced to take the fork to the right, veering away from the men and their guns. The left fork was the fastest way out of the building, but she didn't have a choice. Ashley was grateful she'd memorized every twist of these tunnels. She knew the way out was much longer now, but thank goodness one existed. She continued passing the forks and the turns, relying on her instincts and memory to get her out. Once again, though, her escape was thwarted. She reached a spot where the metal was so hot, she had to back up as quickly as she could, awkwardly wriggling backwards. It took her several precious minutes to reach the last fork. Her fingers were burned from the hot metal, and she was grateful for her special clothing because she knew the rest of her probably would have been burned as well. Ashley continued down this new path, picturing where she was on the map in her mind, relying on her instincts to lead her back to the exit where Henrietta would be waiting anxiously. Had it been 15 minutes already? Had she taken too long in getting the stone away from the army? How far away did it need to be to stop regenerating the men? Finally, Ashley reached the sharp upward turn that indicated she'd made it to the end. She pulled herself up the shaft with her plungers, coughing as smoke billowed past her. Henrietta and two other FBI agents reached down and grabbed her, yanking her up and into the helicopter. Before the door had even shut and Ashley had belted herself in, the chopper lifted off, throwing her back into her seat. She'd made it. But it didn't take long for the lectures and yelling to start. Ashley wouldn't be intimidated, though. She refused to answer anyone's demanding questions, knowing that the adults around her, especially Henrietta, wouldn't even hear her responses until they'd made it back to the mansion. Ashley's parents were waiting near the landing pad, both of them in a panic. Even Ashley's dog was there, jumping at her dad's ankles, yelping for attention. The helicopter landed, and the FBI agents hopped out before helping Ashley out. She followed everyone into the mansion, dreading what was coming next. Chapter 4. I had to. Ashley said loudly over the shouting voices. You didn't see or hear what was going on. Everyone quieted, and that surprised her. Yes, we did, Dad said. We saw the army. But you're right, we didn't actually hear anything. We had no idea why you left the ventilation shaft. Mom glared at her. Don't think you're not in trouble, young lady. I almost had a heart attack when you did that. I know, and I'm really sorry. But like I said, I only had 15 minutes to get the stone out. Her parents glanced at each other before turning to Henrietta for her opinion. The older woman shocked Ashley by nodding. You all saw those men, Henrietta said. They weren't normal. They flickered and didn't appear to be solid. Something definitely was off about them. Ashley was glad to know that the many cameras had actually caught the army before she'd hidden behind the boxes. She hadn't needed to get on her knees after all. Thank goodness. Henrietta continued, I'm inclined to believe that Ashley is telling the truth. Ashley's jaw dropped. Henrietta was agreeing with her. Who was this woman, and what had she done with the critical grouch who'd inhabited her body before? Ignoring the looks of surprise she was getting, Henrietta motioned to Ashley. You have the stone then? Ashley nodded, pulling it from her pocket and placing it on the table in the middle of the room. We need to give it back to the museum, she said, and before anyone else gets any ideas. Henrietta nodded, glancing around the room to make sure no one disagreed. Ashley only hesitated a moment before saying, And I want to go. That would be fine, Henrietta said. You've definitely earned it. Chapter 5. Ashley, her parents and Henrietta stepped off the jet at the private runway in Florida before they stumbled to a stop. She obviously wasn't the only one shocked at what greeted them. Everything living, the grass, the trees, everything was black. She'd been to Florida several times before, even to this particular runway, and all of it had changed from luscious green to a sickly dark shade. What she saw now was a completely different state. Mom, Dad, and Henrietta looked at each other, disbelief and surprise etched into their features. How have the people been surviving? Ashley asked quietly. No one had an answer for her. Their driver took them straight to the museum, where they immediately handed over the stone to a very grateful curator. The man surprised them by starting to cry when it was in his possession again. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you so much. He insisted on treating them to drinks and snacks before they needed to head back to the jet again. On her first step outside, Ashley noticed a difference in the plants surrounding the museum. They were coming back to life. She didn't know what would happen with the stone from then on, but she supposed it didn't matter. It would probably end up back in the Bermuda Triangle, or maybe its original owners would decide to let it stay at the museum again. Either way, justice had been served. The FBI had cracked open the warehouse, and the agents who entered were surprised to find the two men alive. The thieves had apparently thought of everything and had sealed themselves in a fireproof area. They still weren't answering questions. Underneath that metal floor, the agents had found mounds and mounds of ash. When tested, it turned out to be from humans. After a lengthy investigation, the case was closed. The ash from the bodies returned to the graves they'd been stolen from across the country, and the families notified. Ashley knew her adventures were just beginning, and she insisted that her tutoring and training increase in intensity. She became even more focused on her dream of becoming an FBI agent. Her experience at the warehouse had garnered her a lot of attention from agents across the country, and they were practically lining up, begging for her to be assigned to them when she enlisted. Luckily, she had plenty of years to mature and continue her studies before she'd be legally up for grabs. Her first mission had been successful, and she was sure it wouldn't be her last. The end. Would you like to gain access to exclusive audiobooks only available to members of Andrea's Readers Group? Click the link in the description to learn more.